Hi, everybody. This is Scott Segal. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. PRG is our government relations and strategic communications group. And with me going through these slides today on what a potential Biden administration means for energy and environmental issues is my colleague, Eric Washburn, who is Eric, say hello.
Hello, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Eric is a former legislative director to Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle, a former highly placed Democratic staffer on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and really a long history of working on energy and environmental issues, including advising the Biden campaign on some natural resource issues. Also on the call with us is Tim Urban. Tim, say hello.
Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, Tim. After 20 years at Ernst & Young and also a spate of time on Capitol Hill as a tax staffer, is really one of the foremost experts on the nexus point between energy and environmental policy and tax policy. And so he'll comment on some of those issues as well as some of the other budgetary issues that present during this first year of a Biden administration. So as of this weekend, as of Sunday afternoon, Biden had so far received about 75.2 million votes, and that's the most cast for any presidential candidate in history. Donald Trump had received about 70.8 million, which is the second most ever cast in American history. And with calls in Pennsylvania and Nevada on Saturday, the Biden-Harris campaign received greater than the requisite 270 electors that's necessary to clinch the presidency. Now, having said all that, of course, as we sit here today, legal challenges and calls for recounts are proceeding, particularly calls for recounts in the state of Wisconsin and the state of Georgia, and those are likely to continue. However, as even Republican leaders have said in the past, recounts never change more than a few hundred votes, short of the thousands necessary that are at stake in various margins. And so far, the allegations of fraud seem a little thin, at least according to election law experts. So we're comfortable in proceeding on the assumption that the next administration will feature Joe Biden as president and Kamala Harris as vice president. Okay, so this is an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We'll talk about presidential transitions. Their importance. Then we'll talk quickly about personnel in the energy and environmental space. Then we'll talk about the Biden energy and environmental agenda, and we'll end on what we think will be the hurry-up offense for the first 6 months of the Biden presidency. Key campaign players, the Biden campaign featured a climate task force, which had co-chairs of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the progressive Brooklyn Congresswoman, and Secretary John Kerry, former Senator John Kerry from Massachusetts, certainly well known as not only a leader, but somebody specifically leading on climate change. And I think what you see is represented in this task force is the yin and the yang, if you will, of how Vice President Biden was advised on climate change issues. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, one of the authors of the Green New Deal, John Kerry, more of an institutionalist, with confidence in the more traditional deliberative process that we're going to find in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Eric, is there anything you want to add at this point before we get into campaign advisors?
No, I think that I guess the only thing I'd say is that the selection of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and John Kerry reflects the need that the Biden campaign felt in the spring to try to bring the left wing of the party into his coalition, and so those two were selected. It did create a bit of a rift with organized labor, who felt a bit excluded from the climate change task force. But by the time the recommendations on climate change were announced in mid-July in the Build Back Better plan, the labor and sort of progressive wing of the party had gotten together and were all in support of the plan. But it did signal that the Biden folks felt like they had some real work to do to get the support of the more progressive wing of the party.
Well, let's talk about campaign advisors now that played sort of outsized role as they were putting together. And for those of you who are listening in today, who might have been on a conference call or two, you might have with some of the folks in the Biden campaign, you might have seen some of these individuals featured. So on actual policy positions taken, there were just literally hundreds of people that filled the role of informal or formal campaign advisors, but some of the more central ones to the positioning of this campaign were Jake Sullivan and Steph Feldman in particular on policy issues. Jake Feldman with more of a national security bent to him, and Steph Feldman more on these domestic public policy issues that included things like clean energy development and climate change. Eric, you want to walk through some of the rest of these? And I should say, lest he be accused of hiding his light under a bushel, that Eric also served on one of the committees dealing with energy and really climate change policy development. So, Eric, why don't you walk us through more of the campaign and tell us a little bit about your experience there?
Yeah. So, thank you, Scott. So, I co-chaired the National Sportsmen and Sportswomen for Biden part of the campaign, reaching out to the 50 million hunters and anglers around the country. And then I was also part of the policy committee, one of 20 policy committees actually, on mine was on climate, energy, and environment. And as Scott mentioned, there were probably 500 or so people like myself who were staffing that. So it was quite a bureaucracy. But what we're trying to do is really take the goals that were laid out in the Build Back Better plan of July and to create some granularity around that, sort of a roadmap to how do you get there in the first, say, year of a Biden administration. If you look at the campaign advisors, they really kind of group into two categories. One are really policy people, and I put Jake Sullivan, Steph Feldman, Colin O'Mara into that category, and others are really more political people. Larry Strickling, John McCarthy, David Kiva, Lonnie Stevenson, Ron Klain, and it worked out pretty well as a good mix. The one common theme I think throughout all these people is that none of them are wild revolutionary progressives. These are people who've been in politics for a very long time, have a very sober sense of what can and should get accomplished. They're left of center, but they're not far left of center. And I think that's a reflection of the candidate himself. And I think it's going to be an indication of what you see in terms of the tone and tenor of a Biden administration.
Right, and there are a few other names here. Obviously, they're campaign players. We draw a circle around the last two on this list: Colin O'Mara, who is the current CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, and who's been a former head of the Delaware Environmental Agency, and therefore has played sort of a key and trusted role on these issues. We'd also draw a circle around Lonnie Stevenson there, who is the international president of IBEW, which is the electrical workers, and gets to the sort of the guardrail function that Eric was referring to a moment ago that organized labor has played in positioning the campaign. Let's go ahead and turn to the transition now. Okay, so the transition is headed up by former Delaware Senator and former Chief of Staff to Joe Biden and longtime friend to Joe Biden, Ted Kaufman. And Ted Kaufman was a person appointed to the U.S. Senate after Biden became vice president at the beginning of the Obama administration. So he was the acting senator, essentially, and is a very trusted person. And this, along with Colin O'Mara, who I spoke about a moment ago, emphasizes the familiar players from the state of Delaware that will, I believe, populate not only the transition but also eventually the administration itself. In terms of transition, I want to make one overall comparison here, which is you may recall that the Trump administration got off to a bit of a slow start with its transition because President-elect Donald Trump fired his head of transition shortly before formal transition activities were about to get underway. That was former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and that was sort of a drama point that we saw early on in the Trump administration. We don't think we're going to see that kind of drama affecting a Biden administration, in the sense that, there's something about 47 years in public service that gives you a little, it has allowed you to smooth the edges a little bit. So we think the transition program will move well. For those of you who are interested in transition matters, I would note that last Wednesday, and this is sort of evidence of how quickly transition is moving out. Last Wednesday, the transition website already went live, and on Sunday, the website was updated to list 4 priority areas for the campaign: response to COVID-19, economic recovery, racial equality, and climate change. So for those of you interested in energy and environment, obviously climate change, part of the big 4 that the transition team is focusing on. Eric, any more about transition?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is they've been a little bit superstitious during the campaign of announcing who was going to lead the various cabinet agencies in the transition. I think they were a little bit remembering what happened with the Clinton campaign in 2016, when they really pulled together a fairly robust transition ahead of the election, and then of course lost the election. But I do think in the next few days, and certainly the next week or two, the transition is going to come into clear focus, and I expect that the people leading the cabinet agency teams will generally be populated with former cabinet secretaries and high level officials, White House officials from the Obama administration. We're expecting Ken Salazar, for example, to lead the Interior position.
Hey, Eric, let's go to the next slide, because I think it may be on that.
Okay.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, go on. No, keep going.
No, I was just going to say, so we expect, Ken Salazar to probably be leading the Interior Department transition, Tom Vilsack to lead the USDA transition. It's unclear yet at EPA, but I've heard Carol Browner may be involved in that. So these are going to be familiar faces that we got used to during the Obama years, and they of course know about the budgets and the policies and so forth, and where the bathrooms are in these cabinet agencies. So I expect the transition will be professionally run and fairly smooth without a whole lot of drama.
So important for listeners, when we talk about transition officials, we're talking about those in charge and supervising the landing teams that might actually go into agencies to begin to develop the early day policy initiatives and begin to make recommendations even on placement of key officials. But generally speaking, if you're in charge of transition for a particular subject area, you don't become the cabinet secretary or the head of the agency related to it. Because these are often people that have done that in the past. And so on this slide, we see who some of the actual potential appointees might be. And I think that's important. The first round of cabinet announcements aren't expected until later this month. Likely during the week of Thanksgiving, though, we'll begin to hear some announcements regarding cabinet positions, with more coming out through the month of December. We think that the president-elect is likely to roll out top staff for White House jobs, perhaps as soon as within the next week or so. So we'll get a good sense of exactly who's in charge of what. Now, this is a list of individuals that we think are under consideration for energy and environment, but of course, we didn't cover the White House itself, and there's a lot of discussion about who might be the White House chief of staff. I think one of the early favorites, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but it might be Ron Klain, who was, was the chief of staff to the vice president when he was vice president, and has had many high-profile jobs, not the least of which was Ebola response, which, while the nature of that crisis isn't quite the same as COVID-19, at least is some practical experience that can be brought to bear. But there are many other people that could be on that list. You've talked about Jake Sullivan, your good friend Eric Tony Blinken. Maybe there are all kinds of people that could be it. Even Cedric Richmond, the young congressman from New Orleans. So yeah, these are all possibilities.
Yeah, I've heard that, Scott. And there's 2 other names. Steve Ricchetti, who worked on the campaign. And the other name that it may be a bit of a dark horse, but wouldn't surprise me, is Ken Salazar. I've heard that former Secretary Salazar is interested in going into the administration. He's already been Interior Secretary, so presumably he wouldn't go back there, but might be given a big job at the White House, and I wouldn't be surprised to see him at Chief of Staff.
Okay, now let's talk about energy and environmental officials. John Kerry, we've talked about before. And remember, in this particular case, we're talking about filling some specific positions. The administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, the secretary of the Department of Energy, the secretary of the Department of Interior, but also perhaps a newly constructed position of climate czar. Now, the Obama administration had a climate czar too, but that position, as the climate issue receded as a legislative issue, that position became less important. I think it's one way to say it. So if we are talking about the Environmental Protection Agency, I know a lot of people on this call are interested in EPA. There are a number of names that have been discussed that are sort of familiar. Mary Nichols, the current head of the California Air Resources Board, the chair of that, who announced her retirement at the end of this year, and has been the runner-up for this job on two separate occasions that I can remember. That's a possibility. Heather McTeer-Toney, who was the Region 4 administrator at EPA in the Obama administration, former mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, and is somebody who has been quite interested in environmental justice-related issues. Currently the national field director for the Moms Clean Air Force, and anybody who's testified at an EPA hearing knows about that organization. There are other people listed on this list that are possibilities for EPA. We've talked about Colin O'Mara, obviously, before. There are other individuals as well. The one thing I will say, and I want to drop a big footnote here, which is that we do not know the disposition of the United States Senate. And I'm not sure we have a slide here on the Senate, so this is as good a place as any to make this overarching point. Right now, the Senate hangs in the balance. There are two votes, two Senate seats, both in the state of Georgia, that are due for a runoff in January 5th of 2021. If both of those seats were to go to the Democrats, then in effect, both the House and the Senate and the White House would all be in Democratic hands, because Vice President Kamala Harris would act as the tie-breaking vote as the president of the Senate, which is a usually honorific title that you get by being vice president, but would actually play a very important role here. And why is it important to have 51-50 when that's not that big of a lead? Well, on the one side, it would allow for confirmation, perhaps, of slightly more progressive individuals to fill these energy and environmental seats. Secondly, it might change the rules of the U.S. Senate with respect to filibuster, and we'll get to that in a moment when we talk about what the legislative agenda will look like. And third, it would allow the Senate to be organized with Chuck Schumer as the majority leader, and with all of the committee chairs and the larger staff allocations being on the Democratic side of the aisle. So it's very important what happens in Georgia. I don't believe we're making actual predictions here, but I would say this: for two Democrats to win statewide in Georgia when there is not an unpopular Republican incumbent at the top of the ticket seems like a really difficult thing to do. So I'm not predicting, I'm just making an observation. Eric, you want to add something on that?
Yeah, the only thing I say, I agree with that, Scott. The only thing I'd add to that is that if the Democrats don't take the Senate, it's going to be very, very, very hard for President Biden to make a lot of progress legislatively, or maybe make any progress legislatively on his ambitious climate agenda, which means that most, if not all, the progress that he will be able to make on his climate agenda will be through these executive branch agencies using their existing legal authorities, which makes these picks for the cabinet's secretaries of the key agencies very, very important, and they realize that. So follow those closely in the next couple of weeks, and we'll get a sense of they say personnel is policy, and who he picks to lead these agencies will really determine the policy going forward, and frankly whether they have the political skills to be successful in pushing forward an ambitious climate agenda.
Yeah, three more observations on officials. One, if you're interested in Interior, we believe the next Interior Secretary will likely be from the great state of New Mexico, the land of enchantment. Number two, keep your eye on Ali Zaidi, the last person on the list here, to have a White House level position, maybe NEC, maybe just a senior advisor to the president on climate and energy policy. He currently serves in that role really for Governor Cuomo, and he is a alumni of the Obama administration. And last, for the Department of Energy, we keep forgetting to put this person's name on the list, but probably the person with the most likelihood of success is current professor at Georgia Tech, Liz Randall Sherwood, who was Deputy Secretary of Energy from 2014 to 2017. She's an expert more on the nuclear side of the House rather than the energy policy side of the House. And the most important thing is she's a former staffer in the Biden Senate office. And of course, that's important when you were in public service as long as Joe Biden has been. Almost everybody in town has worked for him at one time or another, and certainly worked around him at one time or another. All right, let's move to the next slide. Let's talk about Biden's possible energy and environmental agenda. So let's go to the first slide next. Okay, we could have chosen any one of a number of slides here. This is just to demonstrate the role that climate change played in the election. Now, it's pretty clear, at least if we believe exit polling data, which maybe we shouldn't anymore, that climate change was not among the top four considerations of people leaving the exit polls or exiting the polling places. Those would be in order: the pandemic, the economy, racial justice and/or police reform, and law and order issues. And voters who chose those issues, went for Biden or Trump, depending on which of those issues there were. Now, the role of climate change is interesting because people do care about it more. There's been a sea change in how climate change is viewed. Americans will agree that there's too little federal action. They're actually willing to pay for more of it, and that viewpoint is increasingly bipartisan. But it is not generally ventured by a voter unless it is prompted. But once prompted, voters are quite enthusiastic about climate change. Eric, is there any observations you'd make on that?
No, I think you're right. Although I do think that, again, if Republicans stay in charge of the Senate, you're still not going to see much of any legislative work go on climate change. There are two issues that have emerged where you might find bipartisan agreement. One is on so-called natural climate solutions, which is really paying farmers and forest owners to sequester carbon in soils and in trees. And the other area is in energy innovation. But absent that, it's really going to be up to Biden to figure out what he can do with existing legal authorities through EPA and some of the other agencies.
Right. Well, let's dig a little deeper in that. Let's move to the next slide. Okay. The next slide, the general energy, environment, and climate policy issues. Now I'm going to start with a précis here. I think it is, we are all well advised to not disagree very much with Eric Washburn. But I do want to make one observation here, which is that Joe Biden has spent the better part of his professional career by a long shot in the United States Senate and believes he has a unique understanding of the United States Senate. He has friends on both sides of the aisle, including, quite frankly, Mitch McConnell, the potential or even likely Senate Majority Leader when the Senate reconvenes in the next year. And as a result, while I would make the historical observation that divided government tends to be productive government. So that means, and I think Eric was saying this, that it's not a zero sum proposition about what emerge from the U.S. Senate, but a next United States president is going to have to make it a high priority if they're going to produce actual and substantive climate policy issues. There are other areas aside from offsets or natural sequestration of the sort that Eric described. There is, for example, carbon capture and sequestration, which we'll talk about in a moment, technology policies, spending on research, and even some regulatory issues, phasing out of hydrofluorocarbons, and even potentially a clean energy standard, which brings us to the first bullet here. Net zero emissions no later than 2050 for the entire economy, and decarbonizing the power sector by 2035 are discrete promises that Joe Biden has made in the context of his energy plan. And these will certainly take legislation in order to accomplish, and that would be a high hurdle in the event of a Republican Senate. That said, there are bipartisan, in fact, there are bipartisan efforts underway to come up with the four corners of a clean energy standard with a generous definition of what constitutes clean energy. Like, for example, Congressman McKinley and Congressman Schrader, a Republican and a Democrat, have a very noteworthy bill on this score. We've been in active conversations with the members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee who also have bills that could proceed with more generous definitions. It just depends on how it's sold and what kind of political capital is willing to be spent by a White House and when. One thing we know for sure that will happen is the re-entering of the Paris Accord, and I might also add the re-engagement with the World Health Organizations. Whether Biden pushes for stronger commitments or not in re-entering Paris, he might have to anyway, because when you step out and then you step back in, there is a thought that you would readjust your so-called national commitments. But I don't believe he has to do that, but that may give him cover to do so if he wishes to do so. Ending regulatory rollbacks, including executive orders and EPA regulations, guidance documents, particularly things that have not been concluded at this point. There are literally hundreds of these that he could do it. And I also want to drop another footnote here. You will see that Joe Biden will release an executive order which imposes a moratorium, an executive memorandum actually, which imposes a moratorium on any uncompleted major regulatory actions coming out of the Trump administration. That you should not find that to be strange, because the truth of the matter is every administration that changes between political parties does that, all right? Whether it's Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat, doesn't matter. They all do such a moratorium, and they'll do it again here. If you parboil down everything that Biden has talked about in his recent energy plan, you will see he spends more time talking about technological optimism or spending on research, development, and deployment. And so we are going to see that. We are going to see requests for expanded spending as part of what Eric referred to a moment ago as the Build Back Better approach that the new administration is attempting to undertake. That said, none of this happens without political accommodation and without negotiation. And so we'll have to see how much of that is advanced. One thing that I would say to folks on this call: there will be more of an emphasis on scalability and commercialization in this kind of spending, because he's trying to get the direct economic benefit of these programs to be realized as part of economic recovery. So scalability and commercialization, much more important than past government labs initiatives. We'll talk more about climate disclosure later. We'll talk more about ending fossil fuel subsidies, Buy American provisions. This is something different, obviously, and something that the Biden end of the Democratic Party particularly stresses. But both of these efforts, applying prevailing wage, buying American for component parts, can change the cost effectiveness of underlying environmental standards, something very important to think about. We'll talk about environmental justice later. Whether or not there's new legislative authority is dependent on what happens in the Senate, but it can still be used as a lens to make priority decisions about environmental enforcement and about permitting. So there you could still see change, even if environmental justice is not subject to broader legislative treatment. And as Eric and I are fond of saying, a complicated view of natural gas, which we'll get to in a moment. Let's change the slide. Okay, in fact, that moment has come. And we'll talk about natural gas production, and we'll talk about in a moment the market for natural gas. Well, Eric, there's no surprise the progressive left opposes natural gas production, including utilizing hydraulic fracturing. And of course, Joe Biden went out of his way. Yeah. Go on. You pick it up from here.
No, I was just going to say you're exactly right, and I think had it not been for, frankly, the politics of Pennsylvania and Ohio, we might see a Biden campaign and eventually a Biden administration oppose fracking, because it seems to be a central tenet of the progressive left's view of natural gas. However, it is so important in Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania is so important in every national election that early on, the Biden folks made the decision they were not going to oppose hydraulic fracturing, and I think that was the right decision, frankly, both environmentally and politically. At the same time, I think he wanted to show the progressives in the party that he was not going to be overly supportive of oil and gas, and so we saw the Biden campaign, Biden himself talk about banning new leasing for oil and gas on federal lands and federal waters, and I think we've seen an openness to doing away with some of the existing tax incentives that are enjoyed by the oil and gas industry. That will be determined by what happens in the Georgia elections and who controls the Senate next year. Biden himself will have some ability to, in fact, suppress or eliminate oil and gas development, new oil and gas development on federal lands and waters. But he's tried to thread this needle. I'm not sure he's made anyone particularly happy, but politically, it's gotten him to the presidency, and I think that, in large part, was the purpose.
Yeah, and one thing I would say is, even if there is attention paid on methane, there has been great strides with respect to the way industry operates on methane already since the last time we talked about expanded authority, like a new source performance standard for methane. And so we don't regard this as quite the same hickey that it was previously when this was under discussion. Let's move on to the next item. Okay. Now, look, this has always been a central conundrum of the campaign. You're supportive of natural gas production, and you tell folks in Pennsylvania that there will not be a ban on hydraulic fracturing on private lands, but there will be perhaps some limitations on public lands. There's still the little matter of that 2035 clean energy standard, which is supposed to decarbonize the sector, and federal procurement policy also used to purchase 100% clean energy that diminishes basically the market for natural gas. In addition, there may be some effort to restore the Clean Power Plan. We do not believe that will restore it in exactly the same four corners that it was previously proposed and finalized, because that encountered some rather severe legal problems last time around. And the objectives of the previous Clean Power Plan have somewhat been overtaken by events. So our suspicion is that they may try and resurrect something. They might even call it the Clean Power Plan out of a sense of nostalgia, but I don't think it'll be exactly what we saw previously. And there's this notion that a Biden administration might support ongoing plaintiffs' climate litigation. Right now, climate litigation has been notably unsuccessful, but if the administration were to jump in with both feet and were to support such climate litigation, what would that mean for the success rate? What would that mean for undermining business confidence? And what would that mean ultimately for the market for natural gas? Those are questions we don't have answers for them, but they are interesting questions that we'll need to resolve. Let's go on to the next. Actually, well, let's go on. Obviously, the environmental community has long determined that pipelines are a weak point they're sort of the weak point in the garden hose, if you will, for the fossil fuel economy. And Biden opposed the construction of the Keystone XL, which while that's an oil pipeline, not a gas pipeline, it's still richly symbolic of the whole issue. He's pledged to require any federal permitting decision to consider the effects of greenhouse gas and climate change. Now, the truth is that's, as many of you probably know, that's already a statement of the law in terms of consideration. But the question is, what do you do with that once you consider it? There has been much time and effort spent reforming the guidance offered for the NEPA process and dealing with Section 401 of the Clean Water Act as a mechanism to allow recalcitrant states to get in the way of pipelines and other forms of linear infrastructure. And there's been support in the current administration for a more muscular nationwide permitting, which has encountered its own, obviously, tough sledding in the federal courts. That said, all of these things are statements of guidance and interpretation, which can be reversed by the next administration. We don't know that they would do this all in one fell swoop, because they are trying to marshal the component parts of of economic recovery, and that might be inconsistent with that. We do think, however, that when major infrastructure projects are advanced, the consideration of environmental justice will be a high priority because it is one of the key issues for the base, at least as it looks toward environmental protection. And of course, the case of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is rich evidence of the fact that an environmental justice based critique of a pipeline can be quite detrimental to success. Let's move along. Okay. You noticed in a slide above we talked about corporate disclosure requirements for upstream and midstream companies. This is a very important issue. A lot of it has to do with independent agencies like the SEC or expert agencies like the Department of Treasury. What they're going to do, who will be appointed, is a very important consideration. There are, we don't think Elizabeth Warren is going to be the Secretary of Treasury, but there are people that share her views, at least about corporate disclosure on climate change, that could become Secretary of Treasury, and that would make for a much more expansive approach to disclosure. It also might make for an imposition of a so-called stress test for lending institutions who might be lending to upstream and midstream assets, to ask of those assets what their plan is for addressing climate change. So there are issues there as well, and that can, at a fundamental level, affect access to capital, which can affect the construction of infrastructure. That said, build back better means you got to be able to build, and so we don't foresee that corporate disclosure requirements will be used as an absolute bar, nor could they be, to the forward progress on infrastructure. Let's move along. All right, I was hoping we didn't drop this slide out. One of the bright spots, and I'm going to let Eric talk about this because I'm losing oxygen over here. But one of the bright spots is liquefied natural gas. There were no particularly negative statements made about LNG during the course of the Biden campaign. And Eric, why do you think that is?
Well, if you look at Joe Biden's career, I mean, he is the consummate internationalist. He chaired for a while the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He cares deeply and is very interested in international relations. He understands the pressure right now that Europe is under vis-a-vis Russia and the building of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the concerns that Russia will have undue influence over EU decisions because of its energy trade. And so Biden understands that to the extent that the U.S. can provide liquefied natural gas to the Europeans, and even in some small respect wean them off Russian natural gas, it'll help give the EU more independence from Russia and shift their axis of influence towards the U.S. So he has a keen understanding of the role that energy trade can play in foreign affairs, and I think you will see a Biden administration that will frankly be quite supportive of U.S. LNG exports, particularly to Europe, but also to a lesser extent to Asia. It's going to, as Scott said, it's going to be one of the bright spots in a Biden administration for the natural gas industry.
Yeah, I'll just add one little bit of color commentary on this, which is even as the Paris Accord was being signed during the Obama administration, Biden, at the exact same time, was busying himself in Eastern Europe, encouraging countries there to either utilize hydraulic fracturing technology or, in the alternative, to buy U.S. liquefied natural gas as a way to undermine both the access to hard currency and the foreign policy position of Putin and Russia. As a foreign policy expert, Biden thinks those things are extremely important, and that's perhaps another reason why we haven't heard a whole lot about problems with LNG exports from the U.S. Let's go to the next. Okay, this administration, the Trump administration, has been, as everyone knows, sort of famously opposed to robust trade with China and to other parts of the world. Frankly, And this has affected supply chain considerations for both renewable energy and for electric vehicles with respect to batteries, critical minerals, and the like. And not just China, but many other places as well. So here's our prediction on these matters. We think that given where Joe Biden has been through a long career, particularly remember what we said about union issues and Buy America issues, that hard line will not be instantly relinquished simply because there's a change between from the Biden administration, from the Trump administration to a Biden administration. But wrapping this whole slide up, I'll tell you this much. Biden considers himself to be an expert on foreign policy, and that's true if it's foreign economic policy or national security and the like. We believe he will be much more likely to use the regular order of multinational organizations to advance his cause on trade, including supply chain issues. And he will be much more likely to work in coordinated activity with our allies before proceeding in this direction. So on the one hand, don't look for abrupt changes in these supply chain issues. On the other hand, there is light at the end of the tunnel in the sense that there's a likely replacement with multilateral and allied mechanisms to address these issues. All right, let's move along. Renewables. I feel like we've talked about this in the sense that we've talked about that 2050 and 2035 date. And we've also talked about Biden as technological optimist, which explains that $400 billion in clean energy R&D funding and the desire to establish what is called an Advanced Research Programs Administration Level C. You might be familiar with ARPA-E, which was to focus on energy and environmental issues in terms of original research. This goes beyond it. C is for commercialization, for moving that technology to market, and that's important. Obviously, we've talked about federal lands and the need to develop renewables on federal lands. This is particularly true of offshore wind, that I know many of you are interested in there, but also in other instances of federal lands, and also establishing an appropriate regulatory and legislative framework to advance it. But as we've noted in the past, it's difficult to pass a clean energy standard if the Senate ends up being retained by the Republicans. On the other hand, restoring, expanding, changing the Clean Power Plan, or accelerating the goal of the purchase of carbon-free power, all of these things can change based on executive authority. And of course, tax credits, which we'll talk about in a moment with its own special slide. So let's move on. Carbon capture and sequestration. I want to give the Biden campaign a little bit of bravery points for talking about carbon capture and sequestration. The far left of the party has been unsupportive of CCUS, if only because in order for this technology to be effective, it presupposes the existence of continued reliance on fossil fuels. But here, Joe Biden shares the statements that are made by the relevant coalitions related to CCUS and understands that you really can't get to deep decarbonization without rigorous deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. So as a result, part of that Clean Energy Fund is dedicated to CCS, and there is support for not just the 45Q tax credit, but expanding it. Let's move on. Hydrogen, yeah, okay. It is very difficult to address yourself to clean energy development and energy storage without hearing the word hydrogen very frequently uttered. And the Biden administration is no different on that. He wants to focus some of that ARPA-C attention that we discussed a moment ago on hydrogen. But even broader than that, with this emphasis on renewables, which is many of which are inherently intermittent, the story of energy storage does not just end with batteries for a Biden administration, but also extends to hydrogen. And then also, as we move forward, and Americans still continue to depend on natural gas for heating their homes or using particular appliances, or continue are looking at more conventional motor fuels for internal combustion engines, hydrogen can be a component part which decreases the carbon footprint of those traditional fossil fuels. So it has a very bright future, frankly, to play, and we suspect the Biden administration, we know the Biden administration is very likely to advance in that direction. I think my good friend Eric's probably too shy to say it, but I know he's had some conversations on hydrogen too.
Yeah, and I think, you look around the world as more and more countries seek ways to meet their Paris climate agreement obligations. Green hydrogen in particular is emerging as a fuel of choice, certainly in the EU, in Japan, to a certain extent in China and Australia. And I think you're going to see it start catching on more and more here. It's a very versatile fuel. Green hydrogen is produced using electrolysis powered by wind and other renewables. But I expect to see a pretty strong future for green hydrogen in the coming decade.
All right, well, let's move to the first 6 months. Okay, next. All right, and we're going to divide this between administrative actions and legislation. So let's next. Okay. I'm going to bring, since he's been so patient, I'm going to bring Tim Urban back in on this. And that's with respect to carbon pricing, where there's been a bit of a love-hate relationship, it seems, between Joe Biden, the individual, and the idea of a carbon tax or a carbon pricing mechanism. But Tim, why don't you pick up the cudgel here?
Okay, Scott, and thanks very much. I guess, looking at Eric's famous Washburn corollary suggesting that there will be little legislation and more regulatory action, I think that is probably 100% accurate, especially with regard to policy bills in the environment and energy sector. One area where I think there's a possible partial exception to that rule would be with regard to tax for two reasons. First of all, it's very difficult for the Treasury Department to make a lot of policy with regulations absent new legislation. So, certainly they can tinker around the edges, but really they need new bills to do things like raise the corporate tax rate or double the GILTI fees or any of that kind of stuff. So with regard to what kinds of things are viable, if, again, we're assuming the Senate stays Republican, I think, a carbon tax is one of these things where initially our sentiment had been that it's not the first choice for progressives, but if indeed the Senate had gone to the Democrats so that they had a clean sweep, it could be that in the absence of big policy mandates, they could do something about using a carbon tax in a budget reconciliation bill. Now, I think, post-election, if you believe that the Senate will stay Republican, I think that, again, there's these two tranches of tax items. There are tax items that are possibly in play as a part of a big negotiation, and there are tax items that are less likely to be in play. I think the carbon tax, candidly, is probably less likely to be in play next year because, candidly, I'm not sure what hammers the administration has over the conventional energy industry to get them to acquiesce to one. And if that's not possible, I think that, Republican senators who are traditional champions of the conventional energy sector won't necessarily support a carbon tax unless, of course, the carbon tax is set at a level low enough to mollify them, which may not be what progressives want.
All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, I'm afraid this is you again, Tim.
So along with the carbon tax, I think that broad repeal of oil and gas tax incentives, using a meat cleaver may not be within the realm of the possible for the Biden administration, if indeed the Senate stays Republican. But I would note, kind of looking towards future slides, that I do think there is there's a scenario you can see that there could be some deal making on tax, which would allow the Biden administration and House Democrats to get some of what they want in the energy and environment space using the levers of tax policy, because there would be things Republicans would be willing to trade for. So on to the next slide. Scott, do you mind if I keep going?
I would love it.
Okay, so again, if you hypothesize that there will be a predictable flow of revenue bills moving through Congress over the next couple of years, because of course there are must-pass items that do require changes in the tax code, like changes in the highway taxes to make sure that they have enough money for highway spending and things like that. You'll have some opportunities where the negotiators will sort of be dragged to the table. And, a couple of points I'd like to make. First of all, there are things that Republicans want. There are temporary provisions that were enacted as part of the Tax Cut and Job Act that are vital to Republican members that they might be willing to barter for. And there is also a host of these renewable energy, alternative energy, energy efficiency items that really have a bipartisan constituency on Capitol Hill. These green tax incentives, although, clearly the president has not been a huge fan, there are areas where basically the constituencies of the progressives sort of overlap with the constituencies of the Republican senators, even the oil state senators, like 45Q, the carbon sequestration, hydrogen energy tax incentives, biofuels like biodiesel and cellulosic ethanol, energy storage credits, and offshore wind credits. So you could see a situation where there's a big negotiation. Democrats want something, Republicans want something, and without President Trump and the Treasury Secretary Mnuchin there to torpedo the plan like they've done several times in the last year or two, you could see the progressives getting some of their energy and environmental ambitions done through the tax code in a way they probably can't do it as part of a big mandate policy bill.
All right, let's go to the next. Thank you, Tim, for that. That's good stuff. As Eric prefigured at the top, heavy reliance on administrative actions, particularly if we are dealing with a situation where the Senate remains in the hands of the Republicans. I would note here that we're going to get a lot of these administrative actions, even if the Senate goes to the Democrats, because these can be advanced and they can put short-term paint on the target by doing so. So we've already talked about these: rejoining Paris, aggressive methane limits, both on federal lands and off federal lands, climate risk disclosure we've talked about, enhanced enforcement we've talked about, EJ we've talked about, rolling back EOs, support for clean energy, restoring some version of the Clean Power Plan, but probably not exactly the one we saw previously. I'm not sure they're going to be in a real rush to tighten national ambient air quality standards. If one of the big four issues we saw in exit polls was enhancing the economic recovery of the United States, there is an inverse relationship between the tightening of the NACs and economic recovery, many would say. Let's talk for a second, though, about vehicle and fuel standards, because this means a couple of different things. Biden was part of the effort to negotiate expanded CAFE or corporate fuel economy standards when the auto bailout occurred in the Obama administration. So it feels a little bit important. It feels an important relationship to the CAFE program. Also, obviously, this relates very directly to whether California will continue to benefit from its waiver under the Clean Air Act. And one would imagine, particularly if Mary Nichols is chosen as the EPA administrator, who's a California regulator, that's going to be a priority to make sure that's fully restored and that legal objections to it are ameliorated. Fuel standards is a little bit more difficult to get visibility into because there are a lot of different issues at play here. We do know this, that the Biden campaign did not spend a lot of time on the architecture of the existing renewable fuel standard. So they will. But they also did strongly criticize the Trump administration on some issues related to implementation of the renewable fuel standard. So we suspect that for a while at least, they're going to be somewhat bullish on the RFS, although it's not perhaps a great personal significance to the president-elect. There are other things, too, that he's interested in. He's spoken about expanding electric vehicles to include 500,000 new stations or charging stations. We do believe the next administration is not likely to require by mandate more use of EVs, except in the context of federal procurement, and is more likely to see it as an opportunity to build out green infrastructure. Now, if the Biden administration does wish to expand corporate average fuel economy, to us and also has spoken in terms of wishing to double down on cleaner next generation liquid motor fuels, then we suspect that whatever those liquid motor fuels are, they'll have to have a higher octane, because in order to get improved vehicle efficiency, you're going to need, you're clearly going to need higher compression engines, which require more octane. So, what is the vehicle and fuel policy moving forward for the Biden administration? It's a bit of a jump ball because there hasn't been a tremendous amount of clarity here, but it could include things like creating an envelope for states to proceed with low carbon fuel standards, or even looking at a federal approach to a low carbon fuel standard if they're feeling pretty plucky about how to interpret existing authority. It would include taking some actions on the renewable fuel standard, particularly as we address the RFS, the sort of diminishment of the renewable volume obligation that we're going to see under the RFS. It could include CAFE, it could include higher octane, it could include EV fuel charging stations. That's a lot of stuff potentially on vehicle and fuel, even when not much of it was talked about with great specificity during the course of the campaign. I know you love this issue, Eric Washburn. So is there more you want to say on this?
No, Scott, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Okay, and we also we haven't talked about in changing essentially the numerator on social cost of carbon, which would allow for more aggressive action on permits, or might even allow for better cost-benefit analysis for regulations claiming to reduce carbon footprint. So that's important, and that's something that the White House could do through the Office of Management and Budget. And then we've talked about the creation of ARPA-C, of existing legislative authority, which I think is fine. We do want to issue one warning about simply rolling back EPA or rolling back executive orders that have been put out. So this is the next slide, please. So I used to say to people, a new administration comes in, they take a big box of old executive orders and guidance document and light them on fire, and off they go. But because of the Trump administration's attention to some Obama actions, there's actually been some case law which has grown up, not the least of which is the Supreme Court decision in the DACA case back in June, which does actually make it more difficult to set aside executive action of a previous administration unless you've got a good reason to do so and it's borne out in an administrative record, and if there has been widespread reliance on the previous administration's interpretation. And so that is a limitation that will have to be grappled with by the Biden administration, and that's important. If things have become final rules, then there's all kinds of case laws we know about every T that must be crossed and I that must be dotted to turn over a final rule. Not the least of which is can you even stay such a final rule? And if you do so, what must the administrative record look like? What questions must you answer before you could do it? So I only put this slide in here to say the following. It's not all open field running to overturn everything that occurred. There are still questions that can be raised and litigation to be had. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, and then this is a good place to end, Eric and Tim, which is what potential legislation could a divided Congress undertake? And you see here we have a bunch of issues here: a climate change program, specifically a clean energy standard, infrastructure, EVs I've talked about, and tax, a robust tax agenda, and of course a robust spending agenda, the flip side of that tax agenda. Any or all of these are possible for action, but it'll take good negotiation on the part of an administration. Luckily, Biden prides himself on his working knowledge of the U.S. Senate. Let me turn it to Eric.
No, I think that's right, Scott. The only thing I would add is just in a divided Congress with a Republican Senate and a Democratic administration, any progress you're going to see on these issues is going to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and particularly with respect to a national climate change program, probably a clean energy standard, in electric vehicles and taxes. It's going to be incremental. It's going to be born out of tough negotiation. And maybe that's what makes the public more comfortable. I think people generally like divided government for that reason. But I think a lot of the promises that were made in the July Build Back Better plan of the Biden folks probably won't get done, certainly in the next 2 years. But you could see some small progress made incrementally on some of these things.
Tim, do you have any last thoughts on this about getting stuff done in a divided Congress?
Sure, Scott. So first of all, the tax lobbying bar is getting ready for a very crazy year next year. So I think there is a perception that there will be an opportunity to do a lot of policy through tax bills. And secondly, I would note that one of the two things I would really watch if I were an interested taxpayer, one is right now, all these members of the House and senators are preparing to reintroduce next year the seminal bills that didn't get enacted this year, but are looked upon by many people as sort of the bellwether of what's going to happen in this area. Like, for instance, the Efficiency Savings Act for 25C tax credits, things like that. So first of all, I would say that, look for when these bills get introduced, what they look like, whether they have a bipartisan composition, because that'll tell you a lot about, what people expect to be able to get done. And then the second thing is, of course, that the president's budget and the Treasury Green Book is obviously the seminal work for the entire Congress. And seeing how Biden approaches the Congress and seeing how his Treasury Secretary does in front of the tax writing committees after the Green Book is sent up to the Hill, I think that'll tell us a lot.
Well, I agree with that. And what I can say at this point is we're at the end of our time period. And, obviously, as time goes by, we'll be able to refine predictions or analyze actions with a little bit more granularity. And we look forward to doing that with everybody on the call. If people have questions, please do get in touch with us. You can, there we go. There's our pretty nuts. Anyway, you can obviously reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to respond to you with in more detail. So thanks, everybody, and I'll turn it back over to our friends in the environmental group.